They asked me what I'd ever done for them. Imagine that 3 grown adults standing in my living room, staring down at the man who paid for their every breath since the day they were born, demanding an accounting like auditors at my deathbed. So I gave them one, line by line, dollar by dollar. And when the will was read, the total came to $3,217,456.12, not a cent more. Not a cent less. The pen had trembled slightly in Harold Whitmore's liver-spotted hand as he signed the last page. His attorney, a young woman with the patience of stone, looked at him with something between pity and disbelief. "You're certain about this, Mr. Whitmore?" she'd asked, fingers pausing. Above the crisp legal sheets, "Absolutely certain." "Dead certain," Harold had said, and he'd smiled when he said it. "If they want to know what I've done for them, they'll get the bill of a lifetime, but the truth didn't start there, with the will or the venom. It started years before, back when Harold still had the strength to mow his own lawn and the children still came home for Thanksgiving without inventing excuses. Before the grandchildren stopped sending drawings and started sending texts. Before he was reduced to a checkbook with a fading signature. In Tuesday, the Whitmore Place Realtors, the legend abroad. Sun-washed house perched above the Connecticut River, trimmed with white lattice and hydrangeas that smelled of Somera. Harold had built it himself, almost literally. His construction company, Whitmore and Sons, had raised half the homes in Windsor County. The irony was not lost on him that the and Sons part had never been more than a dream on paper. His sons Elliot, Greg, and his daughter, Madeline, had all gone their separate ways, none of them taking to the trade. Eliobit Gama, hedge fund manager in Boston, a man whose suits cost more than Harold's first pickup truck. Greg chased degrees across the country architecture, then urban planning, then some nebulous consultancy that never quite turned into anything. And Madeline, the youngest, turned her back on the family entirely after her mother's funeral. Harold hadn't seen her in nearly 10 years. Though she still cashed the checks he sent every December, for old time's sake, he remembered the day everything began to rot. It was spring one of those forms aids ways, son of after son who feels like forgiveness. He'd been sitting on the porch, nursing black coffee, watching the forsythia bloom. The phone had rung. Dad, Elliot's voice, smooth as a salesman's, carried the practiced courtesy of someone who'd rehearsed empathy. "We need to talk. Greg and Maddie and we've been worried about you." Harold chuckled. "Worried? Abuet. You're not getting any younger," Elliot had said, his tone tightening. "And the house, the company. You've got a lot of assets tied up in your name. If something happened, God forbid, it'd be chaos. Assets," Harold repeated. The word curdled on his tongue. "Is that what I am now?" "That's not what meant. To get into sound prized, we just want to help organize things. You know, make sure you're taken care of." "Funny," Harold said. "Didn't know I was in danger of being taken." The line had gone silent for a moment. He could almost hear his son grinding his teeth on the other end. Finally, Elliot said, "Greg's coming up next weekend. Maybe we can all sit down and talk like adults," and they did. Greg showed up in a borrowed Lexus, wearing sunglasses indoors and an expression of reluctant duty. Madeline arrived last, unannounced, standing in the doorway like a ghost. Her hair had gone grey at the temples, and her mother's eyes looked tired of remembering him. They ate dinner in brittle politeness. Harold had cooked himself, roast beef, potatoes, peas with too much butter, the way Eleanor used to make them. But the conversation was all numbers, inheritance, trusts, legal designations. Madeline spoke the least, Elliot spoke the most. "You've got to think long-term," Elliot said, gesturing with his fork. "You can't just leave things vague." "The IRSL'll eat half of it. I built that company from scratch," Harold said, his voice steady but low. "I buried 30 men who worked beside me. Paid for your college, your wedding, your damn roofs when you couldn't afford shingles. And now you want to tell me what to do with what's left of it?" Greg Siged. "Dad, no one's saying you didn't work hard. We're just saying you've done enough. Maybe it's time to let go." "Let go," Harold repeated softly. "Eleanor used to say that too. She wanted me to retire when she got sick. I told her I couldn't." Guess I should have listened. Madeline finally spoke then, her voice barely above a whisper. She just wanted you to be here, Dad, not out on some job site while she... Don't, Harold said, sharper than he meant. Don't you dare finish that sentence. The silence afterward was so thick he could hear the ticking of the old mantel clock. For a long time, no one moved. Then, as if to puncture the tension, Elliot said lightly, Well, Dad, we're just trying to make sure you're being practical. Practical, Harold murmured. You want practical? Fine, I'll make it practical. That was the night he began drafting his will not a will. Exactly, but a ledger. Every hospital bill, every tuition payment, every car, every down payment, every bailout, every favor, every small loan that had never been repaid. It filled pages, then binders, then boxes. 3 months later, when the lawyer called them all together for the reading, the children came dressed in black and expectation. They'd heard he'd been ill lung infection, the kind that doesn't heal at 83. They assumed the worst, but they assumed something else too, that they were about to become rich. Instead, they got the bill. For Elliot, $1,142,309.27 college tuition at Yale, first mortgage, investment in a startup that had tanked. Andadão imigrega $1,02 8,7, 45 tuition. A ruined business loan, 2 cars, and unpaid taxes Harold had quietly settled. For Madeline, $1,029,446.40 medical bills after her divorce, a failed boutique loan, and a trust fund drained to support her artistic pursuits, each total subtracted from what might have been their inheritance. In the end, all 3 figures balanced to 0. And at the bottom of the page, in Harold's trembling but deliberate script, it said, Consider the debt paid in full. Love, Dad. When the attorney finished reading, the room was silent. Elliot's jaw clenched. Greg stared at the floor. Madeline began to cry, not the soft kind, but the deep, shaking sobs of someone who realizes the apology they needed came too late. No one noticed the faint smile on Harold's photograph resting on the mantel. The old man had finally gotten the last word. But what no one knew not yet was that the will contained a second envelope, one marked to be opened in 6 months, and that envelope would change everything they thought. They understood about what Harold Whitmore had truly done for them. 6 months. That was the length of the silence that settled over the Whitmore family like a dust sheet. No calls, no gatherings, not even a text. Each of them had taken their $0 inheritance and retreated into their own quiet corners of shame, bitterness, or denial. Elliot had the easiest time pretending it didn't sting. He threw himself into work, doubling his hours at the firm, trading one obsession for another. Yet every night, when the office emptied and the skyline went dark, he would find his eyes drifting toward the framed photo on his desk. His father at a groundbreaking ceremony, hand on his shoulder, both of them smiling as if they actually liked each other. That smile had begun to feel like an accusation. Greg drank. Allô? He told himself it was to take the edge off, but the edge never went away, it just grew teeth. He lived in a cramped apartment now, rent paid month to month with consulting gigs that barely covered groceries. The pride that once filled his lungs like oxygen had deflated. He used to talk about urban renewal and smart design. Now he just talked about how unfair life was. Especialito Visionaire took it hardest. She'd spent years resenting her father, convinced he'd never understood her, never cared for the things that mattered to her. But the ledger, the way he'd remembered every penny, every favor, every heartbreak hit had broken something open inside her. She hadn't spoken at the reading. She couldn't. But that night, she'd driven to the old Whitmore estate and parked across the street, watching the dark windows like they might blink open and let him speak one last time. The house had been sold, of course. The new owners were a couple from Boston, young, idealistic, eager to restore its original charm. They'd painted the porch a color Harold would have hated. The mailbox still bore his name, though. She'd sat there until dawn, whispering apologies into the steering wheel. When the letter finally arrived, none of them were expecting it. It came in thick cream, envelopes with their full names embossed across the front in Harold's sharp, disciplined handwriting. Even the ink seemed deliberate. There was no return address, just a red wax seal bearing the old company's logo, the crossed hammers of Whitmore and Sons. Elliot opened his first. He was in his office, half listening to a client drone about portfolio diversification. When he saw the name, he dismissed the man with a curt wave, locked the door, and sat down. His hands trembled as he broke the seal. Inside was a single page. Elliot, I suspect you've been angry. That's all right, you always mistook disappointment for betrayal, but there's something you never knew. That Beacon Hill house you live in, I didn't just give you the down payment. Premier Boit. Every square foot. The deed's in your name now. Check the county records if you don't believe me. Consider it my final investment in you, not your funds. You were always good at numbers, but you never learned their weight. Maybe now you will. Dad, he sat there for nearly an hour, the letter trembling in his hands. Then he opened his laptop, and sure enough the records were there. Deed transferred 6 months to the day after Harold's death. Elliot leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling until the weight of something he couldn't name pressed behind his eyes. Greg's letter came to his dingy apartment 2 days later. It was nearly identical, practical. That was the night he began drafting his will not a will. Exactly, but a ledger. Every hospital bill, every tuition payment, every car, every down payment, every bailout, every favor, every small loan that had never been repaid. It filled pages, then binders, then boxes. 3 months later, when the lawyer called them all together for the reading, the children came dressed in black and expectation. They'd heard he'd been ill lung infection, the kind that doesn't heal at 83. They assumed the worst, but they assumed something else too, that they were about to become rich. Instead, they got the bill. For Elliot, $1,142,309.27, college tuition at Yale, first mortgage, investment in a startup that had tanked, and the down payment on the house in Beacon Hill. For Greg, $1,02.8,7, 45 tuition. A ruined business loan, 2 cars, and unpaid taxes Harold had quietly settled. For Madeline, $1,029,446.40 medical. Bills after her divorce, a failed boutique loan, and a trust fund drained to support her artistic pursuits, each total subtracted from what might have been their inheritance. In the end, all 3 figures balanced to 0. And at the bottom of the page, in Harold's trembling but deliberate script, it said, "Consider the debt paid in full. Love, Dad." When the attorney finished reading, the room was silent. Elliot's jaw clenched. Greg stared at the floor. Madeline began to cry, not the soft kind, but the deep, shaking sobs of someone who realizes the apology they needed came too late. No one noticed the faint smile on Harold's photograph resting on the mantel. The old man had finally gotten the last word. But what no one knew, not yet, was that the will contained a second envelope, one marked to be opened in 6 months, and that envelope would change everything they thought. They understood about what Harold Whitmore had truly done for them. 6 months. That was the length of the silence that settled over the Whitmore family like a dust sheet. No calls. No got a ring, not a text. Each of them had taken their $0 inheritance and retreated into their own quiet corners of shame, bitterness, or denial. Elliot had the easiest time pretending it didn't sting. He threw himself into work, doubling his hours at the firm, trading one obsession for another. Yet every night, when the office emptied and the skyline went dark, he would find his eyes drifting toward the framed photo on his desk, his father at a groundbreaking ceremony. Hand on his shoulder, both of them smiling as if they actually liked each other. That smile had begun to feel like an accusation. Greg drank a lot. He told himself it was to take the edge off, but the edge never went away, it just grötit. He lived in a cramped apartment now, rent paid month to month with consulting gigs that barely covered groceries. The pride that once filled his lungs like oxygen had deflated. He used to talk about urban renewal and smart design. Now he just talked about how unfair life was. Especialito visionaries took it hardest. She'd spent years resenting her father, convinced he'd never understood her, never cared for the things that mattered to her. But the ledger, the way he'd remembered every penny, every favor, every heartbreak it had broken, something open inside her. She hadn't spoken at the reading. She couldn't, but that night, she'd driven to the old Whitmore estate and parked across the street, watching the dark windows like they might blink open and let him speak one last time. The house had been sold, of course. The new owners were a couple from Boston Young, idealistic, eager to restore its original charm. They'd painted the porch a color Harold would have hated. The mailbox still bore his name, though. She'd sat there until dawn, whispering apologies into the steering wheel. When the letter finally arrived, none of them were expecting it. It came in thick cream envelopes with their full names embossed across the front, in Harold's sharp, disciplined handwriting. Even the ink seemed deliberate. There was no return address. Just a red wax seal bearing the old company's logo, the crossed hammers of Whitmore and Sons. Elliot opened his first. He was in his office, half listening to a client drone about portfolio diversification. When he saw the name, he dismissed the man with a curt wave, locked the door, and sat down. His hands trembled as he broke the seal. Ainsi doit? Single page, I have been hungry. That's all right, you always mistook disappointment for betrayal. But there's something you never knew, that Beacon Hill house you live in. I didn't just give you the down payment. I bought it. Every square foot. The deed's in your name now. Check the county records if you don't believe me. Consider it my final investment in you, not your funds. You were always good at numbers, but you never learned their weight. Maybe now you will. Dad, he sat there for nearly an hour, the letter trembling in his hands. Then he opened his laptop, and sure enough, the records were there. Deed transferred 6 months to the day after Harold's death. Elliot leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling until the weight of something he couldn't name pressed behind his eyes. Greg's letter came to his dingy apartment 2 days later. It was nearly identical, same wax seal, same precise fold. But his father's words cut in a different way. Greg, you always wanted to design something lasting. You just never understood that permanence comes from purpose, not pride. I held on to one property you never knew about, your mother's childhood home, the little farmhouse on Route 7. I rebuilt it myself using the plans you drew. When you were 22, you left them in my office the day you stormed out. I finished what you started. It's yours now. There's a workshop in the back. Use it or don't. But if you ever decide to build again, build something that forgives you first. Dad, Greg Reed. It 3 times. The first he laughed bitterly, defensively. The second he cursed and threw it against the wall. The third he wept. He drove out the next morning, bottle of bourbon on the passenger seat, unsure whether he meant to see it or burn it. But when he arrived, the house was there exactly as he remembered from childhood trips, a modest white farmhouse, fresh paint, the scent of sawdust and varnish still lingering in the air, and on the workbench inside there was a small wooden sign carved into it in his father's unmistakable hand. Start again. Madeline's letter took the longest to reach her, forwarded through 3 addresses before it found her in a rented studio apartment above a bakery in Providence. She had been painting again small abstract canvases full of blue and rust and grief. When she saw the seal, her breath caught. She didn't open it right away. She made tea, washed her hands, sat on the edge of her bed, and finally carefully broke the wax. Maddie, you were always the brave one. You said what your brothers were too scared to. You made me see myself, and I didn't like what I saw. I'm sorry for the silence that sat between us. It was mine to break, and I never did. There's a storage unit, key taped to the bottom of this letter. Inside you'll find something I've been saving since the day you left, a collection of your mother's sketches. She drew them for you when you were little. She said one day you'd understand the kind of love that has to let go. Keep them, Saf. And if you ever forgive me, hang one where the light hits it in the morning. That's where she used to stand when she painted you. Dad, Madeline found the key tape just where he said it would be. The next day, she went to the storage unit, small, unremarkable, tucked behind a row of mechanic shop. Inside Ramor, this labor reaching mad in her button, the first one, and her knees nearly gave out. Dozens of sketches, crayon, charcoal, watercolor, each of her, from childhood to adolescence. Her mother's hand had captured her face in every phase of becoming, and tucked between 2 of the drawings was another envelope, unsealed this time. If you're reading this, Maddie, then I did something right at the end. I want you to have what I couldn't give your brother, something made not bought. You once told me love doesn't keep score. You were right. That's why this letter isn't an apology, it's an admission. I kept the ledger because I didn't know how else to prove I'd been there. Now I know. The debt was never yours, it was mine. She sat there until the sun went down, surrounded by her mother's skies. None of them spoke to each other that week, yet by some invisible tether all. 3 of them ended up at the old Whitmore cemetery. The following Sunday, 3 cars, 3 strangers with the same last name converging at the same headstone. The inscription was simple: Harold J. Whitmore, 1939-2024. Builder of homes, mender of bridges. Elliot brought flowers. Greg brought the wooden sign. Madeline brought silence. They didn't know what to say, so they just stood there side by side, the air thick with ghosts and late forgiveness. And when they turned to leave, something new lingered between them. Not love, not yet, but the blueprint of it. One not addressed to any of them, but to someone else entirely. Someone whose name they had never heard before, but who had been part of their lives far longer than they realized. The last letter was addressed to Mr. Samuel Pierce. It arrived not in a polished envelope like the others, but in a plain brown parcel, the kind used for utility bills or business correspondence. The postmark was 6 months delayed. Harold had arranged its delivery through his attorney, scheduled for a date that would mean nothing to anyone else but everything to Samuel. He received it on the anniversary of the day he'd first walked into Whitmore and Sons as a 23-year-old foreman, fresh out of trade school, nervous and hungry. Samuel Pierce, right-hand employee, be now Hod's right hands was sold at the Whitmore legacy fade under corporate branding. He'd run the office quietly, efficiently, even when Harold stopped coming in every day. He was the one who closed down the site when Harold got sick, the one who found him after his final collapse in the workshop. When he opened the letter, his coffee went cold beside him. Sam, if you're reading this, then you've outlived me, though I wouldn't bet on you slowing down long enough to realize it. X veuve. Thought about this letter for a long time, because you were more than an employee to me. You were the son I didn't have the patience to deserve. You've seen the kind of man I became in the incalculating, distant, trying to turn love into ledger lines. I justified it by calling it responsibility, but really, it was fear. You once told me that building something real means being willing to tear it down when it starts to rot. I never had the courage to apply that lesson to my family, which is why I'm leaving the company to you. Not the name, not the assets, but the foundation, the trust fund, the tools, the workshop, and the title. Whitmore and Sons belongs to you now, if you want it. Don't change the name. It always meant something different than I admitted. Samuel read it twice, the words blurring slightly as his throat tightened. At the bottom of the page, a single line was written in Harold's shaky handwriting. The ink darker, pressed harder, and if they ever come looking for what I left behind, show them where it really is. The old man had been cryptic like that toward the end. Samuel had assumed it was grief or morphine, or both. But now, standing in his modest office, surrounded by blueprints and dust and memories, he couldn't shake the feeling that Harold had left him with something unfinished. He went to the filing cabinet where Harold had stored the original company documents. The drawers were mostly empty now, save for one old ledger, the same kind Harold used to keep by his knitstand. But when Samuel opened it, expecting numbers, he found something else entirely. Sketches, dozens of them. Hand-drawn plans for houses, bridges, parks, designs he'd never seen before. Each was labeled with a name: Elliot's house, Greg's workshop, Maddie's sky studio, and tucked at the very back, folded carefully between 2 pages, was a map. It showed the old Whitmore estate, but behind the house, beyond the hedgerows and garden, a small red X marked the edge of the property, where the woods began, scrawled. Beside it were the words, the final build. That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. At dawn, he drove out to the estate. The new owners were away, the driveway empty. The morning fog lay thick over the grass, curling around the hydrangeas like breath. Inscription. For the ones I couldn't finish, her voice was quiet but steady. Maybe that's exactly why we should. For a moment, no one spoke. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then Greg stood, dusting his hands. We'd need permits, equipment, hell, a crew. Samuel smiled faintly. Already handled. The company's trust still covers operational expenses. I can get materials by Monday. Elliot stared at him. You're serious? As serious as he was when he poured this foundation, Madeline knelt beside the post, tracing the carved letters with her fingertips. What do you think it was supposed to be? Samuel hesitated, then handed her a folded piece of paper, the last one he'd found inside the ledger. Sealed in an envelope, addressed only with the words "when they're ready." She unfolded it carefully. Inside was a sketch rough, incomplete, but unmistakable. A long wooden structure with tall windows, open beams, and a steepled roof. It wasn't a house. It wasn't a workshop. It was a chapel, not for worship, but for memory. A place to stand and remember what had been built and what had been broken. Madeline's eyes shimmered. He wanted us to build this. Elliot took the paper from her hands, studying the faint pencil lines. You're saying Dad wanted us to work together, after everything? Samuel nodded slowly. I think he wanted you to see what it feels like to build something that doesn't just belong to one of you. The siblings exchanged. Glansunésia, on certain de dismissive. And in that quiet clearing, with sunlight spilling over the half-forgotten concrete, something shifted between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a beginning. Greg exhaled. If we're doing this, we do it right. I'll handle the design. Elliot smirked faintly. I'll handle the money. Madeline's voice was soft. And I'll make some mules, my lad, eyes glistening. Then, let's build your father's last gift. And as the wind rustled through the leaves, carrying the faint scent of sawdust and summer air, it almost felt just for there with them, watching trees, the ledger finally closed. But what none of them yet understood was that the chapel's foundation held more than concrete and intention. Beneath it, sealed deep within, lay one final secretive message Harold had buried himself, one that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about the Whitmore legacy. They didn't discover the secret until the second week of construction. By then, the air had changed between them. The awkward silences of their first days, working together, had softened into something almost familiar banter that occasionally held warmth instead of barbs. They rose early, dressed in work boots and dust-streaked clothes, and met under the canopy of birch trees that bordered the clearing. Madeline painted the sky on her easel before the sun crested the tree line, chasing light with the same fervor her mother once had. Greg handled the blueprints, pacing like a man with ghosts to outrun. Elliot came last, grumbling about dirt under his nails, but quietly proud when his measurements matched the plans to the millimeter. Samuel was always there, watching them with the quiet patience of a man who knew the dead still spoke through the living. By the 10th day, the chapel's skeleton stood proud against the sky, a frame of timber and glass that caught the light in golden splinters. It was on that day that Greg noticed the irregularity in the foundation. He was marking the placement for the north wall when his hammer hit something that sounded wrong. Not the dull thud of concrete, something hollow. He frowned, crouched down, and rapped the spot again. The same hollow echo. Sam, he called, come take a look at this. Samuel wiped his hands and joined him. You hit rebar. Greg shook his head. No, it's something else. He pried at the edge with his crowbar, and a thin section of concrete flaked away, revealing metal. Not rusted steel, but a sealed box, a time capsule, maybe. About 2 feet long, rectangular, embedded directly in the concrete slab. Madeline and Elliot hurried over. Was this in the plans? She asked. No, Samuel said softly. Harold didn't mention anything like this. Elliot crouched beside the box. We're opening it, right? Madeline frowned. Maybe it's not meant to be opened. Greg snorted. Dad buried it under our chapel. If he didn't want it found, he'd have hidden it somewhere else. Samuel hesitated. He'd known Harold long enough to recognize that man's kind of secrecy. It wasn't meant to withhold. It was meant to be discovered when the time was right. He nodded. Let's see what your father left us. They worked carefully, chiseling away the concrete until they could lift the box free. It was heavy, the kind of weight that suggested purpose. The latch was rusted, but after a few minutes with a screwdriver, it gave. Inside were papers, photographs, and one small wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. The papers were yellowed, but legible handwritten notes in Harold's precise, blocky script. Madeline picked one up, reading aloud, If you found this, Then you've built what I couldn't. I buried this here not to hide it, but to anchor it to remind whoever comes after me that every foundation needs a story beneath it. She looked up, eyes wide. Greg unfolded another sheet. These are letters, he said. To us. There were 3 envelopes, each labeled with their names, and beneath them, one more addressed simply to Samuel. Elliot reached for his, but Samuel stopped him. Wait, he said softly. Read them together. That's how he'd have wanted it. So they sat on the raw, wooden floorboards of the half-built chapel. Sunlight filtering through the open beams and opened their letters. Elliot's was first. Elliot, you spent your life learning to win. But life's not a transaction, and love doesn't pay dividends. Maybe you should have been there and do the same. Don't. The house you live in now is yours not because you earned it, but because I wanted you to remember that having something doesn't mean owning it. Invite people in. Let it get messy. Let it breathe. That's how you know it's alive. Elliot folded it, silently, his throat tight. Greg, read next. Greg, you always wanted to make something that lasted, but permanence isn't. In concrete, it's in forgiveness you were the one who could have built this chapel from nothing. Now you have. Don't make the mistake I did of confusing perfection. For love, let it be imperfect. Let it stand anyway. Greg pressed the page to his knee, staring into the trees then. Madeline's turn. Maddie, you inherited your mother's heart and my stubbornness. A dangerous mix. I couldn't speak your language while I was alive, so I built this as a translation. Every beam, every nail, it's an apology, in wood and light. You want Sally never sob when it's Ematu. She covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Samuel's was last. His voice trembled when he read, Sam, I saved the best lesson for you. You taught me what loyalty looks like, but you never learned how to stop carrying the weight of men like me. This chapel isn't mine anymore. It's yours to finish, not with your hands, but with theirs. When it's done, give it to the town. Make it a place where people come to remember that nothing built from love is ever lost. Silence fell, not the uneasy kind, but the kind that feels like prayer. Madeline was the first to speak. He buried his goodbye under our feet. Greg nodded slowly, a builder to the end. Elliot's voice cracked. We thought he was punishing us. He looked around at the unfinished chapel, the beams rising like ribs around them. But he was teaching us how to finish what he started. Samuel smiled faintly. That's what fathers do, even when they don't know how. They sat there until the light shifted, until the forest turned gold, until the sound of hammers began again, not from obligation, but from something closer to grace. Over the next months, they finished the chapel together. It became more than wood and glass. It became their reconciliation, their inheritance. The walls filled with laughter, arguments, tears, and the quiet rhythm of saws and nails. When it was done, they named it Whitmore Hall, not a church, but a place for the town, a venue for weddings, funerals, art, shows, and music. A place where people could build new beginnings on an old foundation. On opening day, the town gathered. The mayor gave a speech. Children ran through the grass, and at the center of it all, the 3 Whitmores stood beneath a stained glass window, depicting a single image, a hammer crossed with a paintbrush. Beneath a rising sun, it was Madeline's design, based on the same way she always had. The beams caught the light, throwing a kaleidoscope of gold and violet across the floor. She stood for a while at the threshold, hand resting on the polished frame, breathing in the scent of cedar and sun. Morning, Dad, she murmured, still holding up. I see. The air answered her in its quiet way, settling, sighing as wood does when it's loved. A rusted blue truck pulled into the gravel lot. Greg climbed out, shoulders stooped, his hands rougher than ever, but still strong. He'd spent most of the past decade teaching apprentices in town, kids who wanted to build with their hands instead of screens. Behind him, a young man jumped down from the passenger side carrying a toolbox. This is Jake, Greg said as they approached. One of my best. I wanted to see where it all started. Madeline smiled at the boy, maybe 20, his palms stained with sawdust and ambition. You came to the right place, she said. A few minutes later, a sleek black sedan pulled up. Elliot stepped out, silver-haired now but still impeccably dressed, though his shoes looked strangely out of place in the gravel. He carried a manila folder under one arm and a small bouquet under the other. Couldn't miss it, he said when his siblings turned toward him. 25 years. Can you believe it? Barely, Madeline said, smiling. You still allergic to manual labor? Only when it interferes with dividends. They laughed, the kind of laugh that carried the weight of time, but not its pain. Samuel was gone by then. He'd passed 5 years. Earlier, quietly, in his sleep. The town had buried him beside the Whitmore family plot at Harold's request, something written into the will in small, tidy script no one had noticed for years. On his headstone, under his name, were 3 words, asterisk he kept building, asterisk that morning, the siblings had gathered to unveil a new addition to the holler, small memorial garden on the south lawn, built where the old birch trees had once stood. The garden's path wound between raised stone beds of herbs and wildflowers, ending at a bronze statue cast by one of Madeline's former students. Itwa Roldonaque sticked men. He was seated on a bench, hat in hand, head slightly bowed as if studying the earth. His expression was patient, thoughtful, almost humble. At his feet sat a single open ledger, sculpted from the same bronze. The inscription on the pages read, asterisk asterisk love is the only work that never ends. Asterisk asterisk. A crowd gathered for the unveiling old carpenters, artists, students, and families who had been married under the chapel's beams. Greg spoke. First, his voice gravelly but strong. My father built this place to fix something he broke, he said. Turns out, he built it to fix all of us, not just our family, but this whole town. He used to say, every nail's a promise. Make sure it holds. Well, 25 years later it still does. Applause rippled softly through the crowd. Elliot followed, unfolding a paper from his folder. Where? Opened Whitmore Hall. I told myself it was just another asseter thing to manage. I was wrong. It's not an investment. It's an inheritance. No effweld, but of responsive vaguely. Dad would probably hate me getting sentimental. So I'll just say this. Thank you, old man, for the balance sheet that finally came out right. Laughter rose from the audience, and even Madeline chuckled. Then it was her turn. She stepped forward, eyes glistening, and spoke without notes. When I was a kid, my father built me a dollhouse. She began. It wasn't much, just scrapwood, crooked paint. But première loved. Years later, I asked him why he never made it perfect. He said, because perfect things never get played with. She looked up at the stained glass that gleamed above them, its colors dancing across the statue's bronze. Whitmore Hall was never perfect, she continued. Neither were we, but we lived in it. We're playing each other, and that makes it perfect enough. The applause this time was longer, deeper, less celebration, more communion. When the crowd finally dispersed, the siblings lingered in the garden. Elliot placed his bouquet at the statue's base, white hydrangeas, just like the ones that had once lined the old estate. Greg took a seat beside the bronze figure, setting down his tools. You know, he said quietly, I think he'd like this view. Madeline smiled. Yeah, always preferred the south light. They sat in silence a long while. The breeze stirring the wildflowers, the scent of earth and metal mixing in the air. As the afternoon waned, a young girl wandered up the path, a child of maybe 10, carrying a sketchpad nearly as large as herself. She stopped near Madeline. Are you the lady who paints the skies? The girl asked. Shyly, Madeline laughed. I used to be. The girl held up her drawing, a rough, colorful version of Whitmore Hall with a rainbow sky behind it. My teacher said we should draw something that feels like home. I drew this. Madeline felt her throat tighten. She crouched down, studying the picture. It's beautiful, she whispered. You know, I think my dad would have loved that. The girl smiled. Did he build this place? Madeline looked up at the chapel, at the bronze statue, at the sunlight streaming through the trees. Yes, she said softly. And we just keep building what? He started. The girl nodded solemnly, then ran back toward her parents. Elliot watched her go, a wistful smile on his face. Looks like the Americans gerecht kled. Good. Menger to Madeline Rose, brush her knees. No, she said gently, her gaze softening on the horizon. They'll teach us how to keep going. The 3 of them stood there as evening rebuilt, a town rebord, a legacy renewed. And when the last of the light slipped through the stained glass and fell across the words on the bronze ledger, it seemed for just a moment as though the letters shimmered, anew alive again, in the twilight. Love is the only work that never ends, and so it didn't, because long after the Whitmores were gone, long after the world forgot the price of a 3.2M Itemized billed the echoes of their hammers, their laughter, and their forgiveness would continue to ring through Whitmore Hall, reminding anyone who walked beneath its beams that the greatest structures ever built were wurde eremado e flov. Forgiveness and the courage to rebuild. Again and again, and again years passed like the slow movement of sunlight across the walls of Whitmore. Whole children, who had once drawn their first crooked stars in the foundation, sessions now brought their own children to the same long tables where paint and sawdust still mingled in the air. The whole was no longer just a building, it was an inheritance of spirit. Weddings became anniversaries. Funerals became memories, and every season seemed to write a new chapter in the legacy. Harold Whitmore had begun the day he decided to settle an old score with an itemized bill. By the 50th anniversary, the town of Windsor had changed. The factories that once lined the river were gone, replaced by coffee shops and art studios. But in the